In the gas-lit corridors of the Hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière on a cold March morning in 1864, a 19-year-old seamstress named Marie Leclerc would undergo an ordeal so horrifying that it would haunt the nightmares of every physician who witnessed it. What emerged from her body that day was not a tumor, not a growth, but a living creature that had been feeding on her partially digested food for 7 years. A tapeworm measuring over 30 feet in length, extracted inch by agonizing inch while she remained fully conscious. This is the extraordinary case of the longest parasite ever recorded in 19th century medical literature, a biological horror that challenged everything Victorian medicine understood about the human capacity for survival. The year 1864 found Paris in the midst of Baron Haussmann's grand transformation, a city caught between medieval squalor and modern ambition. Emperor Napoleon III's vision of a new Paris was slowly taking shape, with wide boulevards cutting through ancient neighborhoods like surgical incisions through diseased tissue. Yet beneath the gleaming facade of the Second Empire, the old Paris persisted, a labyrinth of narrow streets, overcrowded tenements, and workshops where the city's army of seamstresses, laundresses, and factory workers struggled to survive on wages that barely covered the cost of bread. The Hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière, that vast complex of buildings sprawling across the 13th arrondissement, served as both hospital and asylum for Paris's most desperate cases. Originally built as a gunpowder factory, the Salpêtrière, it had been converted into a hospital for the poor in the 17th century. By 1864, it housed over 4,000 patients in conditions that ranged from merely inadequate to utterly appalling. The hospital's reputation was built not on comfort, but on the pioneering work of physicians like Jean-Martin Charcot, who would later become famous for his studies of hysteria and neurological disorders. The medical wards reeked of carbolic acid, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar sweetness of approaching death. Gas lamps flickered along corridors lined with peeling paint, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The hospital's charity wards were located in the basement levels, long rooms with barred windows that barely allowed enough light to distinguish day from night. Here, the city's poor came to die with whatever dignity the overwhelmed staff could provide. French medicine in the 1860s was experiencing a renaissance of scientific inquiry, led by figures like Claude Bernard, who pioneered experimental medicine, and Louis Pasteur, whose work on fermentation was beginning to revolutionize understanding of disease. Yet parasitology remained a primitive science, with physicians relying more on ancient texts than empirical observation. Tapeworms were known to exist. Medieval physicians had described them as white serpents that lived in the bowels, but their life cycles, transmission methods, and treatment remained largely mysterious. The prevailing medical theory held that parasites arose through spontaneous generation, materializing from corrupted humors within the body, rather than entering from external sources. This belief led to treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, purging with mercury, bloodletting to drain the corrupted blood, and the administration of powerful purgatives that often killed patients before addressing their parasitic infections. It was against this backdrop of medical uncertainty and urban transformation that Marie Leclerc's symptoms first manifested. Though none could have predicted the extraordinary creature that had taken residence in her intestines, growing longer and more complex with each passing month as it fed on the meager nutrition she managed to consume. Marie Leclerc had arrived in Paris from the countryside of Normandy in the spring of 1857, one of thousands of young women drawn to the capital by promises of employment in the city's expanding textile industry. At 12 years old, she was small for her age, with the pale complexion and calloused fingers that marked her as a child of rural poverty. Her parents, tenant farmers struggling to survive on a plot of land barely large enough to feed their family, had sent her to Paris with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who worked in the garment district. The cousin, Madame Rousseau, operated a small workshop in the Marais district where a dozen seamstresses worked 16-hour days, creating the elaborate gowns and undergarments that clothed Paris's wealthy bourgeoisie. Marie's workstation was a wooden table positioned near a grimy window, where she spent her days bent over intricate embroidery work that required such precision that many seamstresses were blind by the age of 30. The workshop was unheated in winter and stifling in summer, filled with the constant sound of sewing machines and the whispered conversations of women who had learned to work and talk simultaneously. Marie's living quarters consisted of a narrow bed in an attic room she shared with 3 other seamstresses, a space so small that the women had to take turns dressing each morning. The building, like most in the Marais, was centuries old, with walls that leaked in winter and stairs that creaked ominously under the weight of its inhabitants. Rats were a constant presence, their scratching audible through the thin walls at night, and the building's single privy served 40 residents, creating sanitary conditions that would have horrified even the most hardened physician. The seamstresses' diet consisted primarily of bread, thin soup, and whatever scraps of meat they could afford on their meager wages. Sunday dinner might include a small portion of beef or pork, often purchased from street vendors whose hygiene practices were questionable at best. It was likely during one of these Sunday meals, sometime in late 1857, that Marie consumed the undercooked beef that contained the tapeworm larvae that would eventually grow into the monster living in her intestines. For the first few years after her arrival in Paris, Marie appeared to thrive despite the harsh conditions. She was known among her fellow seamstresses as a cheerful girl, with nimble fingers and an eye for detail that made her valuable to Madame Rousseau. Her work on wedding gowns and ball gowns was particularly prized, and she gradually earned enough to send small amounts of money back to her family in Normandy. However, by 1861, her fellow workers began to notice changes in Marie's behavior and appearance. Despite eating constantly, consuming portions that seemed impossible for her small frame, she was losing weight at an alarming rate. Her cheeks, once round with youth, became hollow and gaunt. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, and her skin took on a yellowish pallor that the other seamstresses attributed to too many hours working by lamplight. Most disturbing were Marie's eating habits. She would devour her meager breakfast of bread and coffee, then spend her lunch break searching for additional food, often begging scraps from other workers or purchasing stale pastries from street vendors with money she could ill afford to spend. Her appetite seemed insatiable, yet no amount of food could restore the healthy appearance she had possessed as a young girl. Marie herself was aware of the changes in her body, but she attributed them to the hard work and poor living conditions that were the lot of all seamstresses. She had heard stories of girls who worked themselves to death, their bodies simply wearing out from the constant strain of detailed needlework and inadequate nutrition. What troubled her most were the strange sensations she experienced in her abdomen, a feeling of movement that seemed independent of her own bodily functions. At first, these sensations were subtle, easily dismissed as hunger pangs or the normal gurgling of an empty stomach. But as months passed, the movements became more pronounced and more frequent. Marie described them to her roommates as feeling like a snake writhing in my belly, though she laughed nervously when she said it, not wanting to appear hysterical or mad. The other seamstresses nodded sympathetically, assuming she was describing the common digestive problems that plagued workers who survived on poor food and constant stress. By the winter of 1863, Marie's condition had deteriorated to the point where her work began to suffer. Her hands trembled as she attempted the delicate embroidery that was her specialty, and she frequently had to excuse herself from the workshop to visit the privy, where she experienced bouts of cramping and diarrhea that left her weak and exhausted. Madame Rousseau, initially sympathetic to her employee's plight, began to express concern about Marie's ability to complete her assigned work. The final crisis came in February 1864, when Marie began passing what she described as white ribbons in her stool. At first, she thought these were fragments of undigested food, or perhaps pieces of fabric that had somehow found their way into her system. But the ribbons appeared with increasing frequency, and Marie noticed that they seemed to move with a life of their own when she examined them in the chamber pot. Terrified and no longer able to hide her condition from her roommates, Marie finally confided in Celeste Moreau, an older seamstress who had become something of a mother figure to the younger workers. Celeste, who had seen her share of medical horrors during her 20 years in Paris, immediately recognized the white segments as evidence of a parasitic infection and insisted that Marie seek medical attention at the Hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière. The journey to the hospital required Marie to walk nearly 3 miles across Paris, a trek that left her exhausted and breathless. She arrived at the hospital's charity clinic on the morning of March 15, 1864, carrying a small cloth bundle containing several of the white segments she had passed, hoping they might help the physicians understand her condition. The clinic was already crowded with patients suffering from the various ailments that plagued Paris's working poor: tuberculosis, syphilis, industrial accidents, and the countless infections that flourished in the city's overcrowded tenements. Dr. Auguste Morel, the physician who first examined Marie, was a man in his early 40s who had dedicated his career to treating the diseases of poverty. He had trained under some of France's most distinguished physicians and had developed a particular interest in parasitology, though his knowledge was limited by the primitive state of the science. Dr. Morel's initial examination of Marie revealed a young woman who appeared to be suffering from advanced malnutrition despite her claims of constant eating. "Mademoiselle Leclerc," Dr. Morel said, his voice gentle but concerned as he palpated her abdomen, "you present a most unusual case. Your symptoms suggest a parasitic infection, but the extent of your weight loss and the size of the segments you describe are unlike anything I have encountered in my practice. I fear we are dealing with something far more serious than a common intestinal worm." The physician's examination revealed an abdomen that was tender to the touch, with areas of unusual firmness that suggested the presence of a large mass within the intestinal tract. Marie's pulse was rapid and weak, her blood pressure low, and her skin showed signs of severe anemia. Most telling were the white segments she had brought with her, flat, ribbon-like structures that Dr. Morel immediately recognized as proglottids, the reproductive segments of a tapeworm. Dr. Morel ordered Marie admitted to the hospital's parasitology ward, a small section of the building dedicated to the study and treatment of parasitic diseases. The ward consisted of 6 beds in a room that had once served as a storage area, with a single window that provided minimal natural light. The other patients in the ward suffered from various parasitic infections: a dock worker with a massive liver fluke, a butcher whose hands were riddled with hydatid cysts, and an elderly woman whose intestines harbored multiple species of roundworms. Over the following week, Dr. Morel and his colleagues conducted a series of examinations designed to determine the exact nature and extent of Marie's parasitic infection. They collected and analyzed her stool samples, documenting the size and frequency of the proglottid segments she passed. The segments varied in size from small rice-like pieces to larger structures nearly an inch in length, all of them containing thousands of microscopic eggs that would eventually develop into new tapeworms if consumed by an appropriate host. The hospital's primitive laboratory facilities allowed for basic microscopic examination of the parasitic segments, revealing the characteristic features of Taenia saginata, the beef tapeworm. This species, Dr. Morel knew from his reading of German medical literature, could grow to extraordinary lengths within the human intestine, sometimes reaching 20 feet or more. However, the frequency and size of the segments Marie was passing suggested a specimen far larger than any previously documented in medical literature. Dr. Morel consulted with his colleagues at the Académie de Médecine, seeking advice on the best approach for treating such an extensive parasitic infection. The standard treatments of the era included the administration of powerful purgatives designed to expel the worm, but these carried significant risks of dehydration and shock, particularly in a patient as weakened as Marie. Alternative approaches included the use of anthelmintic drugs like santonin or male fern extract, but these too carried risks of toxicity that could prove fatal. As Marie's condition continued to deteriorate, Dr. Morel made the decision to attempt manual extraction of the tapeworm, a procedure that had been described in ancient medical texts but rarely attempted in modern practice. The technique required the patient to fast for several days to encourage the worm to move toward the stomach, followed by the careful insertion of a tube through the mouth and into the digestive tract. The worm's head, or scolex, would then be grasped with forceps and slowly withdrawn, taking care not to break the creature and leave portions behind that could regenerate into a new infection. The procedure was scheduled for March 22, 1864, in the hospital's small surgical theatre. Unlike the grand amphitheatres found in teaching hospitals, this room was a converted storage area with a single operating table and minimal lighting. Dr. Morel would be assisted by Dr. Henri Dubois, a young physician with experience in gastric procedures, and two nurses whose primary responsibility would be to monitor Marie's condition and provide whatever comfort they could during the ordeal. Marie had been fasting for 3 days prior to the procedure, consuming only small amounts of water and beef broth to maintain her strength while encouraging the tapeworm to move toward her stomach in search of food. The fasting had left her even weaker than before, but Dr. Morel believed it was necessary to increase the chances of successfully locating and grasping the worm's head. On the morning of the procedure, Marie was brought to the surgical theatre on a wheeled stretcher, her small form barely visible beneath the hospital's coarse blankets. She was conscious and alert, though clearly frightened by the prospect of what lay ahead. Dr. Morel had explained the procedure to her in detail, emphasizing both the necessity of the intervention and the significant risks involved. Marie had consented to the treatment, understanding that without it, the tapeworm would eventually consume enough of her nutrition to cause her death. The extraction began at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, with Dr. Morel carefully inserting a flexible rubber tube through Marie's mouth and into her esophagus. The tube, barely half an inch in diameter, had been specially designed for gastric procedures and was equipped with a small light at its tip to help guide its placement. Marie gagged and retched as the tube was advanced, but she managed to remain still as Dr. Morel slowly worked it down into her stomach. Once the tube was properly positioned, Dr. Morel began the delicate process of locating the tapeworm's head. Using a combination of gentle suction and careful manipulation, he searched the contents of Marie's stomach for the small, hook-covered structure that served as the parasite's attachment point to the intestinal wall. The scolex, no larger than a pinhead, was equipped with 4 muscular suckers and a crown of hooks that allowed it to maintain its grip on the intestinal lining despite the constant movement of food and digestive fluids. After nearly an hour of careful searching, Dr. Morel finally located the tapeworm's head and managed to grasp it with a pair of specially designed forceps. The moment of contact sent a visible shudder through Marie's body, as if she could feel the disturbance to the creature that had been living inside her for so many years. Dr. Morel paused, ensuring that his grip on the scolex was secure before beginning the slow, methodical process of extraction. What followed was a procedure unlike anything the medical staff had ever witnessed. As Dr. Morel began to pull gently on the tapeworm's head, The creature's body began to emerge from Marie's mouth in a seemingly endless stream of white, ribbon-like segments. Each proglottid was connected to the next by a narrow neck, creating a continuous chain that grew longer and longer as the extraction progressed. The first few feet emerged relatively easily, but as more of the worm was exposed, the extraction became increasingly difficult. The tapeworm's body was firmly attached to the walls of Marie's intestines, and each segment had to be carefully coaxed free to avoid breaking the chain and leaving portions behind. Marie remained conscious throughout the procedure, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination as she watched the creature that had been living inside her body emerge inch by agonizing inch. Dr. Dubois carefully collected each segment as it emerged, laying them out on a series of white sheets that had been prepared for this purpose. The segments varied in size and appearance, with the older ones near the head being smaller and more mature, while those from the middle and tail sections were larger and filled with eggs. The tapeworm's body showed clear evidence of its long residence in Marie's intestines. Some segments bore scars from previous attempts by her immune system to attack the parasite, while others showed signs of regeneration where portions had been damaged and regrown. As the extraction entered its second hour, the medical staff began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of parasitology. The tapeworm continued to emerge from Marie's body with no sign of reaching its end, growing longer than any specimen previously documented in medical literature. Dr. Morell's arms ached from the constant, gentle pulling required to extract the creature without breaking it, while Marie's throat was raw from the passage of the seemingly endless parasite. The procedure took on an almost ritualistic quality as the hours passed. Dr. Morell maintained his steady rhythm of extraction, while Dr. Dubois carefully arranged the emerging segments on the white sheets, creating a grotesque display that filled the small surgical theater. The nurses monitored Marie's vital signs, providing small sips of water when her throat became too dry to continue, and offering words of encouragement as she endured the extraordinary ordeal. Finally, after 3 hours and 17 minutes, the tapeworm's tail segment emerged from Marie's mouth, marking the end of the most remarkable parasitic extraction in 19th century medical history. The creature, laid out in its entirety across multiple sheets, measured 32 feet and 4 inches in length, over 9 meters of living parasite that had been sharing Marie's digestive system for nearly 7 years. The immediate aftermath of the extraction was almost as dramatic as the procedure itself. Marie, exhausted but conscious, experienced an immediate sense of relief as the constant pressure and movement in her abdomen ceased for the first time in years. Her breathing became easier, and she reported that the persistent hunger that had plagued her for so long had suddenly vanished. Dr. Morell carefully examined the extracted tapeworm, confirming that the head and entire body had been removed intact, eliminating the possibility of regeneration. The tapeworm specimen was carefully preserved in alcohol and became the centerpiece of the hospital's pathological collection. Word of the extraordinary extraction spread quickly through Paris's medical community, with physicians from across the city traveling to the Hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière to examine the preserved parasite and hear Dr. Morell's account of the procedure. The case was documented in detail and published in the Bulletin de l'Académie de Médecine, where it became a landmark in the study of parasitology. Marie's recovery was remarkably rapid, considering the ordeal she had endured. Within days of the extraction, her appetite returned to normal levels, and she began to gain weight for the first time in years. The color returned to her cheeks, and the dark circles beneath her eyes gradually faded as her body began to absorb nutrients properly without having to share them with the massive parasite. The hospital staff marveled at the transformation, noting that Marie seemed to have aged in reverse as her health improved. She remained in the hospital for 2 weeks following the procedure, during which time Dr. Morel monitored her recovery and conducted follow-up examinations to ensure that no portions of the tapeworm had been left behind. Stool samples were collected daily and examined microscopically for any sign of remaining parasitic material, but none was found. The extraction had been complete, and Marie's digestive system began to function normally for the first time since her childhood. The young seamstress returned to her work in the Marais district in April 1864, though her experience had changed her profoundly. She spoke little of her ordeal, preferring to focus on rebuilding her strength and resuming her career. Madame Rousseau, impressed by Marie's courage and grateful for her recovery, promoted her to a supervisory position in the workshop, recognizing both her skill and the maturity she had gained through her medical ordeal. Marie continued to work as a seamstress for several more years before marrying a clockmaker named Pierre Dubois and starting a family of her own. She lived to the age of 78, dying peacefully in 1923, having witnessed the transformation of Paris from the medieval city of her youth to the modern metropolis of the early 20th century. Throughout her long life, she remained vigilant about food safety, always ensuring that meat was thoroughly cooked before consumption. Modern medical science now understands Marie's condition as a classic case of Taenia saginata infection, caused by consuming undercooked beef containing the parasite's larvae. The beef tapeworm is one of the largest parasites that can infect humans, with adult specimens commonly reaching lengths of 15 to 20 feet, though cases like Marie's, where the worm exceeded 30 feet, remain extremely rare even today. Contemporary parasitologists recognize that Dr. Morel's extraction technique, while primitive by modern standards, was remarkably effective for its time. The careful, methodical approach he employed, fasting the patient to encourage the worm to move toward the stomach, then gently extracting it through the mouth, remains conceptually similar to modern treatment protocols, though today's methods rely on anthelmintic medications rather than manual extraction. The case of Marie Leclerc contributed significantly to the understanding of tapeworm biology and treatment in the 19th century. The detailed documentation of her symptoms, the extraction procedure, and her recovery provided valuable insights that influenced parasitological practice for decades. The preserved specimen of her tapeworm was studied by researchers across Europe, contributing to the development of more effective treatments for parasitic infections. Modern treatment of tapeworm infections relies primarily on oral medications, such as praziquantel or niclosamide, which cause the parasite to lose its grip on the intestinal wall and be expelled naturally through the digestive system. These medications are highly effective and carry minimal risk of side effects, making the dramatic extraction procedures of the 19th century unnecessary, except in the most extreme cases. The development of improved food safety practices, including mandatory inspection of meat products and public education about proper cooking techniques, has dramatically reduced the incidence of tapeworm infections in developed countries. However, Taenia saginata remains a significant health problem in parts of the world where cattle are raised in close proximity to human populations and where meat inspection is inadequate. Marie's case also highlights the social conditions that contributed to parasitic infections in 19th century Paris. The overcrowded tenements, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition that characterized the lives of working-class women like Marie created ideal conditions for parasitic diseases to flourish. The transformation of Paris under Baron Haussmann, while primarily focused on creating grand boulevards and impressive architecture, also included improvements to sanitation and public health that gradually reduced the incidence of such infections. The psychological impact of harboring a massive parasite for years, as Marie experienced, is now recognized as a significant aspect of parasitic infections. Modern patients who discover they have been infected with tapeworms often experience feelings of disgust, violation, and anxiety that require careful counseling and support. Marie's apparent resilience in the face of her ordeal reflects both the stoic character expected of working-class women in her era and her remarkable personal strength. Marie Leclerc's extraordinary case reminds us that the human body can harbor the most unexpected inhabitants, creatures that challenge our understanding of the boundaries between self and other. Her story stands as a testament to both human resilience and medical courage, demonstrating that even the most horrifying conditions can be overcome through careful observation, skillful intervention, and unwavering determination. The seamstress, who lived with a 9-meter parasite, teaches us that survival sometimes requires confronting the unthinkable, and that healing can emerge from even the most disturbing revelations about what lies hidden within our own bodies. In the archives of the Hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière, her case remains a landmark in parasitological history, a reminder that medicine's greatest triumphs often come from facing the impossible with skill, courage, and compassion. Next time, we'll explore a case that challenged Victorian understanding of human anatomy, a man whose body harbored a secret so extraordinary that it would rewrite medical textbooks and force physicians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about human development. If you found Marie's journey as compelling as I did, consider subscribing to witness more extraordinary cases from medicine's most mysterious chapters. Each week, we delve deeper into the archives where science meets the supernatural, where human endurance confronts biological impossibility, and where the past reveals its most closely guarded secrets. Until then, remember that within each of us lies the potential for the extraordinary, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, but always profoundly human in its complexity and mystery.